We are trying to understand the relationship between language and society. In order to understand relationship between language and society, we started looking at what we know as language acquisition and language learning. We have established that for the purpose of children's acquisition or children's learning, we will be using the two terms interchangeably, as they do not make much of a difference. However, the distinction between the two terms are with categorical meaning when we talk about learning by grown up people. We will be looking at that shortly. We also established the significance of a discussion on language acquisition or language learning for a better understanding of a relationship between language and society, particularly for the purpose of understanding how rules of language, how parts of the rules of the context that comes from the terms of society is important for language, and how such rules can be identified and incorporated in rules of language as part of grammar. We started looking at that yesterday. We will continue our discussion on what we mean by language acquisition and how it works for a better understanding of language and society. We have seen different stages of learning by Ray Jackendorf in clear understanding in a summarized version which is presented in his book Patterns in Mind. We have looked at the significance of those stages for language learning as well, and then we have looked at how it corresponds with proposals in mentalism. We started looking at behaviorism, and we would look at this proposal in short again. Behaviorism deals with many parts of human life where language is one such entity. Language, being part of behaviorism, had certain fundamental understandings in learning of language. The important thing for behaviorist proposal for language learning was language learning is a matter of habit formation. It was called verbal behavior by famous behaviorists like Skinner and etc. For behaviorist proposal, stimulus is equivalent to response. That is, there is a proportionate relationship between stimulus and response. In other words, in the process of learning, the outcome, that is also known as output, is going to be proportionate to input, which was following from the ideas discussed in behaviorism. The analysis of such a thing, where human mind was at least looked at as tabula rasa, a blank slate. And then while considering and evaluating behaviorism and trying to come up with a new proposal for language learning, which is known as Innateness hypothesis, was also what was also considered in a great detail was what we know as Plato's problem. Philosopher Plato has a well known problem which is known as Plato's problem, and we will talk about the implications of that for the purpose of learning language. Plato's problem is, how does it happen that given so little we know so much? In other words, Plato finds a disproportionate relationship between experience and the knowledge that we gain on the basis of that experience. When translated in the domains of language learning, it sounds very close to the proposals of Innateness hypothesis, where input is considered limited, fuzzy, and not sufficient, but output is infinite, grammatical and systematic. This contrast between input and output finds its space in Plato's problem as well, where he talks about disproportionate relationship between experience and knowledge that we have. So, talking about innateness hypothesis or mentalism, proponents of this in the late 50s wondered how come behaviorists did not consider Plato's problem for a better proposal on understanding of language in terms of its acquisition and learning. So, finally, what was known as an innateness hypothesis works as follows. The reason why it is known as innateness hypothesis is because it assumes language as innate human faculty, language as an innate human capacity, innate capacity of human mind, which works on the idea of probability of a stimulus, and the probability of a stimulus simply means fuzzy, limited, insufficient input, which is responsible for grammatical and infinite output. Infinite in the sense that we have capacity to speak whatever we wish to speak, whether or not we have heard or used such sentences before. This is also called perfect learning, and what is most interesting for the proponents of innateness hypothesis is the computation which works in it. 1950s, that is late 1950s, to be precise 1957 onwards, at several time in following 1957, we have had several proposals and a great deal of advancement in understanding, in theoretical understanding of how children learn language and how language works in human mind. For an understanding of relationship between language and society, we will discuss how this innateness hypothesis works. See, the reason why it is important for us to know innateness, because innateness is a fundamental feature of language, as we have discussed earlier also. In Darwin's understanding about language, what he talks about is birds fly, fishes swim and humans speak. In other words, the capacity of flying and for birds and swimming for fishes is innate in the same way speaking is natural and innate for humans. Thus, this proposal talks about language what it means when people say language as innate human capacity. It means every normal human child is programmed, is genetically endowed for speaking. At the age of 4.5 or 3.5, Jack and Duff proposes that probably a child has the vocabulary of 10,000 is not a matter of surprise. This happens because the child does not learn words, rather the child learns the fundamentals of word formation, and that fundamental of word formation, which is also known as language computation, gives the capacity of 10,000 words, or the capacity to use sentences like I want water, please give me a glass of water, sit down, and the distinction between please sit down and sit down. All these things are part of the capacity of a child at the age of 4 or 5, and it is not a matter of surprise because it is genetically encoded, biologically expected, and such a thing makes language as innate human capacity. Now, we will explain this in little bit more details to understand how this actually works in human mind. Let us look at this proposal We have discussed enough about input. In Plato's term, it means experience, and in behaviorist proposal, the term for input is stimulus. However, the nature of input has been different in different proposals. So, for the mentalist proposal, what happens is the nature of input and the nature of output tells us that such a thing is possible, that is, output being grammatical and infinite is possible from a limited and fuzzy and insufficient input because of what happens in human mind, and therefore, mentalists underline the primacy of human mind in learning language. We will look at what happens in human mind in brief for us to understand language acquisition. Their proposal is human mind is not tabula rasa, human mind is not blank slate, and this is the beginning of the difference where we see the role, the comparison of human mind with tabula rasa being rejected. It is not a simple rejection of the term tabula rasa, but it is also the rejection of the idea that in behaviorist paradigm, people did not consider the role of human mind as an important part in learning of language, and this is being talked about in mentalist proposal with primacy. So, the proposal is at the time of birth, every normal human child is born with a capacity which is known as language acquisition device. Now, this is a hypothetical device we underline. This is a hypothetical device. This is why innateness hypothesis is even called hypothesis. So, human mind has inbuilt capacity which is referred to as language acquisition device. This language acquisition device, which is at times synonymous with universal grammar, can also be described as universal grammar being part of it. For the simplicity of description, we would like to consider universal grammar as being part of language acquisition device. This universal grammar is not grammar of individual languages put together or common things of grammars of different languages put together, rather it is fundamental properties of language itself. In other words, universal grammar consists of fundamental properties of language itself. Again, it has got two parts which has been discussed in great details elsewhere. These two parts are principles and parameters. Principles are the properties of language which talk about similarities and uniqueness of language, and parameters are properties along which languages differ from one another. We will not get into the details of principles and parameters at this point for understanding universal grammar. We would only call universal grammar as a bundle of fundamental properties of language. This fundamental property is part of LAD, that is language acquisition device. When two parts now, the input from the immediate society, which is fuzzy and limited in nature, interacts with language acquisition device, in other words universal grammar, and then such an interaction between input and universal grammar allows development of language in the child, and that language will get the name because it is going to be similar to that of the language being spoken in the society. Therefore, it is not a surprise that a child speaks the language, only the language of the immediate environment, and what follows from here, that a child born in Chennai will be speaking Tamil of Chennai and a child born in Delhi will be speaking the language of Delhi, which could be Hindi, Punjabi, or a combination of everything else that is being spoken in Delhi. We will get into the details in terms of the names of language when we discuss other units for understanding language in society. So, we will leave that part about naming of language right here, and we will only say that a child speaks the language of the immediate society, and that is no surprise. Also, what is not the surprise is the capacity that the child develops at the age of 4 from the limited input for the infinite output with the interaction of this mind, because universal grammar in human mind allows this limited input to develop the capacity of language and not words or sentences or sounds. Once again I will repeat, what develops in human mind is the capacity of language, and what also develops because of the input is probably the capacity of language spoken around that, and therefore, the same capacity which could have developed all possible languages spoken in the world or around the child, it only develops the languages spoken around the child, because it is physically not possible for a child to be interacting with the input of all kinds of languages spoken in different parts of the world before the 5 years or 6 years or 7 years of age. In that context, the role of human mind and the role of language acquisition device built in human mind, and the role of universal grammar, which is part of universal capacity for acquisition of language, is very significant in understanding the nature of output and in understanding why a child will be able to perform rules of language, intricate rules of language, intrinsic rules of language at the level of sounds, words and sentences, and also at the level of discourse, which comes from the rules of society. This discussion on language acquisition device and capacity, the genetic or biological capacity of a normal human child, which has been proposed to be hardwired, is responsible for acquisition of language. And this is the proposal of mentalists in response to behaviorist proposal of language being verbal behavior. And this proposal remains one of the significant proposals in learning of language until now. What it develops in us and in children is also known as technically knowledge of language, and this is a technical term only in the sense that it is tacit, it is underlying, and it is the kind of knowledge that definitely grows in our mind, but it is much more than growing up in mind, and it is about the kinds of rules that we know, but we do not know that we know those rules. And it is this knowledge of language which is responsible, which comes out of the interaction between universal grammar and input from the society, and is responsible for developing generative mechanism of a native speaker, which gives the capacity to a speaker to be able to use even unheard of sentences and enables them to separate grammatical sentences from ungrammatical ones. Now, please connect this with the discussions that we have had before about the capacity of speaker. A speaker of a language has the capacity to distinguish grammatical sentences from the ungrammatical sentences of that language in no time, and that capacity comes through this process, is reliable because it is capacity and it is not the ability to judge an individual sentence. Therefore, this knowledge of language is considered a technical part in understanding of language acquisition. This knowledge of language is extended to the knowledge of language use, and the argument here for us to understand the relationship between language and society is such that the knowledge of language use is part of the knowledge of language. Therefore, the argument is the rules of language use comes either simultaneously or soon after, before we could realize from the same input and same interaction from the immediate society. And thus, a child becomes capable of understanding in discourse the distinction between please sit down and sit down. A child also understands the distinction between the context where she is supposed to use terms like thank you and where she is not supposed to use the terms like thank you, or whether or not these terms come out of them. These capacities are part of language use. We have used one more example to understand the capacity of the knowledge of language use from the speakers. We took an example from Hindi to understand three forms of second person pronouns, tum, tu and aap. We particularly focused on tum and aap, and we have given the context in which the form of pronoun tum is used or the form of pronoun aap is used. If we go into the details of that, we realize that there is a unique relationship between the context and the grammar. Not all the uses of tum can be dependent on either context or grammar. A child has to understand both the grammatical rules and the contextual application of such forms to be able to use each one of them in the proper context. Therefore, my argument is that the rules of language, that the rules of grammar and the rules of language use both are part of the knowledge of language which we develop from the interaction between universal grammar and the input. Therefore, the rules of language use is also part of universal grammar. This could not be acceptable in lot of situations. This cannot be acceptable by lot of people, but this has to be understood. The whole discussion has to be understood in the proper spirit to be able to see what we mean by knowledge of language being consist of knowledge of language, taking knowledge of language including knowledge of language use. Thank you.